Today's geopolitical conflicts center around China, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine. After 1 year into the war, China's role in the Russian-Ukraine conflict has become the focal point of international affairs. Sino-Russian and Sino-US relations are of great concern to the world. All eyes are watching. More than 70 years ago, China, the US, and the Soviet Union were at the center of another geopolitical crisis, the Korean War. The interactions between Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, and Kim Il-sung during the Korean War offer us insight into the dynamics of the current geopolitics, as history may likely repeat itself. As the risk of war in the Taiwan Strait looms, we want to understand CCP leaders' motivation for war and their relations with China's Russian big brother. Hello, welcome to Leisrealtalk. I'm Lei. In my February 28th live stream, I discussed how China and Taiwan are both implementing wartime control mechanisms and why it feels like we're getting closer to war. You can check out the program at the end. Meanwhile, the United States is sending warnings to the Chinese that the People's Liberation Army is likely to lose should it launch an attack on Taiwan. The Americans' message is clear. The PLA is inferior in combat, and therefore Xi Jinping should think twice about invading Taiwan. This is Western logic, which says that you make sure you can win before getting into a military conflict. But that's not CCP's logic. The CCP doesn't care about winning or losing in the same fashion as the West does. Historically, the CCP engaged in wars to grow its military capability. The first war the CCP fought outside China's border was for the purpose of obtaining military technology from Russia, and it was the Korean War. In March 1949, North Korea's founder Kim Il-sung went to the Soviet Union to convince Stalin to help him seize South Korea. Stalin rejected the idea for fear of U.S. intervention. Kim then turned to Mao Zedong and sent his Vice Minister of Defense to China in April. Mao pledged his support but said that Kim must wait until after Mao took over all of China. At the time, Mao's army was sweeping across China, defeating Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army. After Mao won the Civil War and established the People's Republic of China in October, he visited Soviet Union from December 1949 to February 1950. It was there, in the USSR, that Mao decided to confront the United States. Stalin, who became less concerned about US involvement, telegraphed Kim on January 30th, 1950, to say that he was ready to support his plan to take over South Korea, but he asked Kim to keep it a secret from China. After Mao left Russia, Stalin and Kim drew up a detailed plan. However, at their last meeting, Stalin scaled back and told Kim that he wouldn't send troops and that Kim had to ask Mao for help. On May 13th, Kim arrived in Beijing to tell Mao that Stalin agreed to war with South Korea. And at 11:30 that night, China's Premier Zhou Enlai asked the Soviet ambassador to confirm it. The next morning, Stalin replied, "North Korea can take action. However, please discuss the details with Mao Zedong in person." Mao then committed to Kim that if the US intervened, China would send troops to South Korea. Mao's interest in the war was not about helping Kim unify Korea. His goal was to force Stalin to help him build a modern Chinese military. Mao wanted to acquire atomic bomb technology and become a military powerhouse quickly. He calculated that the fastest way to achieve this was by helping Kim in the Korean War. So on June 25, 1950, Kim Il-sung launched an attack on South Korea, and the UN Security Council quickly passed a resolution in support of South Korea. 2 days later, US President Harry Truman announced that he was sending troops to support South Korea. He also changed his non-intervention policy toward Taiwan. US intervention was not bad news for Mao. On July 1, 1950, Mao sent Zhou Enlai to tell the Soviet ambassador, "Now we must build up our Air Force and Navy in order to deal with the armed forces of the United States." On September 15th, US troops landed and Incheon in South Korea, cutting off a large number of North Korean troops. On September 29th, Kim asked Stalin to help. On October 1st, Stalin told Mao, "It's time for the Chinese to act." So Mao immediately ordered the Chinese troops already assembled along the North Korean border to get ready. However, all of his Politburo members were against sending troops to Korea. Liu Shaoqi and Lin Biao, Mao's two chosen successors years later, strongly opposed the idea. Lin Biao pointed out that a confrontation with the U.S. would cause huge consequences, as the U.S. had absolute air control and a 40-to-1 advantage in artillery. Like I said, winning the war might not be CCP leaders' concern. Mao had a hidden agenda. He wanted to dispose of the large number of surrendered troops from the Nationalist Army during the Civil War. Sending them to fight in Korea would serve the purpose. But first, Mao wanted to bargain with Stalin. On October 2nd, he telegraphed Stalin, telling him of the Politburo's opposition. And then on October 5th, when the UN forces crossed the 38th parallel, which divides Korea, Stalin telephoned to remind Mao that if he didn't keep his promise to send troops, the USSR wouldn't help China build its air force or navy. On October 19, 1950, the Chinese volunteer troops went to North Korea. 2 months later, they forced the UN troops back across the 38th parallel and restored the North Korean regime. By then, Kim's army was reduced to about 75,000 men, 1/6 of the 450,000 Chinese volunteer soldiers. Chinese General Peng Dehuai became the commander of the Chinese and North Korean allied forces. Peng told Mao that the troops should stop at the 38th parallel, but Mao refused. He insisted that the Chinese volunteer soldiers push south. On December 13th, he sent a telegram saying that they must fight across the 38th parallel. His general Peng Dehuai returned a telegram. "It's 30 degrees below zero. Soldiers are exhausted. Many don't have coats or winter shoes. Many wore single-layer shoes or were even barefoot. They suffer from malnutrition and got night blindness, and the unimaginable losses are likely to occur." But Mao only cared about what he wanted. After the Chinese and North Korean forces took Seoul in early January 1951, President Truman declared a state of national emergency. Secretary of State Dean Acheson called it the worst defeat of the U.S. military in a century. The UN forces then launched a counteroffensive, and the PLA suffered heavy casualties. On March 1st, Mao telegrammed Stalin, "China intends to use her huge human resources to pull down the United States. 100,000 Chinese soldiers have died. We estimate another 300,000 casualties next year. We're sending an addition of 120,000 troops and increasing the total troops to 300,000. We'll fight a protracted war with the United States and spend several years to fight off hundreds of thousands of American lives." In exchange, Mao Zedong got a modern military. 3 months before Truman declared a state of national emergency, the Chinese naval commander went to the Soviet Union to request help in establishing the Chinese Navy. In December 1950, a Chinese Air Force delegation visited the Soviet Union, and in February 1951, an agreement was sealed for the Soviet Union to establish an aircraft maintenance factory in China. By mid-1951, North Korea had been bombed into oblivion, and a third of the adult population had perished. Kim Il-sung wanted to end the war. He went to Beijing in June 1951 to discuss peace negotiations with Mao Zedong. But Mao didn't want a ceasefire because he hadn't fully achieved his goal in obtaining Russian military technology. He told Kim to drag the American forces into Korea as far north as possible. On July 10th, the United Nations and the Chinese Korean Allied Forces began negotiations and got stuck on the issue of repatriation of POWs. Mao insisted that all of the 20,000 Chinese POWs return to China. Most of them had fought for the Nationalist Army. The U.S., however, insisted on non-compulsory repatriation for humanitarian reasons. On July 14, 1952, Kim telephoned Mao, requesting him to accept the terms, but Mao rejected him. Then, a month later, in a speech at Congress on February 2, 1953, newly elected President Dwight Eisenhower mentioned the possible use of the atomic bomb. A nuclear war was music to Mao's ears, and he was absolutely thrilled. He seized the opportunity to ask Stalin for help in building China's nuclear industry. Stalin, however, didn't want China to have nuclear weapons and decided to end the war. But on February 28th, he suffered a stroke and died a few days later. After Stalin's death, the USSR told China to end the Korean War, but Mao insisted on continuing because he still wanted Soviet nuclear technology. But the Soviet Union steadfastly refused it, and on July 27, 1953, a final peace agreement was reached. The Korean War was costly to China. Mao sent about 3 million Chinese troops. Deng Xiaoping told a Japanese communist leader that 400,000 Chinese died in Korea. Author Michael Breen wrote that of the 21,374 Chinese POWs, 2/3 refused to return to Communist China, and that the vast majority chose to go to Taiwan. 1/3 of the POWs who returned to the mainland were treated as traitors and had a miserable ending. As you can see from the Korean War, the CCP's rationale for launching or ending a war follows a different set of priorities and calculations because it has no regard for human suffering and loss of life. Mao used the Korean War to dispose of soldiers from the Nationalist Army and build a modern Chinese military. By the end of the war, China remained a poor country but had the third largest air force in the world with 3,000 warplanes. From Mao's perspective, he won, even though Chinese lost hundreds of thousands of lives. History repeats itself. Now China, the United States, and Russia are entangled over Taiwan and Ukraine. This is part 1 of the CCP's war series. Next, we'll talk about the Vietnam War, which also involves China, Russia, and the United States. Let me end my program by saying that the biggest irony to the CCP is that despite the sacrifices the Chinese made in the war, the North Koreans are not grateful to the Chinese. When staff at the Chinese War Memorial in Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, was asked how many Chinese volunteer soldiers died during the war, the reply was maybe 10,000. In the North Korean version of history, Kim Il-sung was the sole hero who fought against the invaders. That's all for today. Thank you. Please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.